Welcome to the Children in Scotland podcast. This episode was recorded at a meeting of our Strategic Forum held at the end of April 2020. The focus of the meeting was the ongoing impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, with the discussion set around 4 key priority areas: child poverty, now and long-term challenges, the UNCRC, mental health and wellbeing, and how to link the budget to outcomes for children as set out in the National Performance Framework. There are contributions from Scottish Government, as well as organisations representing education, child rights, early years, childminding, social work, play and the arts.
Okay, so thanks very much for Scottish Government attendance and support. Can I propose the following agenda? To kick us off, I was keen that we bear in mind that the added value of this forum is how we can support the coordination and alignment of a range of children and family matters, but particularly the key priorities that we established. And unless anyone shouts out, we're totally wrong, I think we're on track with that. Those 3 to 4 priorities that we identified before are absolutely front and centre to the work that we're all involved in now. Those 4 being child poverty, both the immediate impact of COVID-19 on children and families in economic distress, but equally the longer term inequality and systemic challenges that this pandemic is only highlighting, of course. The second area is UNCRC. The third area was that the forum identified 2 years ago was mental health and wellbeing. And, to be honest, I think our big challenge is how on earth do we put any boundaries around that, given particularly the issues that are being brought to light with the pandemic. And then the fourth area, we just want to give a very quick update on our progress towards looking at how we link the Scottish budget to the outcomes for children that are set out in the National Performance Framework. And I think you'd all agree, when it comes to thinking through the budget issues over the summer and autumn, the children's sector really needs an evidence-based, robust picture to look at how we are going to be investing wisely, what little money, frankly, that the Scottish budget is going to have, and how we can invest that wisely in children's long-term outcomes. So those are the 4 areas. We wanted to give a brief update on each of those 4 in discussion, and then it's clearly important for us to respond and highlight to Scottish Government and each other the areas that are causing us particular concern around the current situation, but also, of course, highlighting good practice. I think we're all involved in so much good. There's so much fantastic work that is being done to make sure that children and young people and their families are kept safe. And I think let's have a little celebration of that too. So highlighting some good work would be very welcome. Okay, does that feel like the meeting that you thought you were attending and will be useful? Okay, well, thanks ever so much. So if we could start with just a discussion around child poverty and an update. You'll remember the forum has a subgroup that helps the forum pull together priorities and ideas, and 2 of those members represent the forum on the Scottish Government Directorate-wide Child Poverty Working Group, which has been great, and there's been some real achievements, I think, as a result of that relationship.
Thanks, Jackie. I just wanted to give a brief update about some of the discussions we've had with Scottish Government over the last sort of month, and also some of our concerns around child poverty collectively. I guess some of these discussions started from a meeting with the Cabinet Secretary for Community and Local Government, and what we were discussing was really thinking about the impact of the crisis on low-income families and what it means for child poverty in Scotland. I guess collectively, we wanted to look at how we can share some of our concerns about the scale of child poverty at the moment and the impact of the current crisis. So across our kind of organisations, we've been looking to kind of bring together the collective impact that we're seeing on the ground from families on a daily basis. And we're obviously concerned that a number of families were in poverty before the crisis started, and that this crisis could compound poverty for those families, both in terms of the persistence or the length of time they might experience that poverty, as well as the severity. But also there's a number of families who were just coping before the crisis, who, because they may have lost jobs, or been unable to access support, and are maybe accessing systems for the first time, are experiencing poverty for the first time. And what this impact has on each and every one of those children and families, but also collectively, what the level, what that means for our kind of national commitment to reduce child poverty by 2030, and for the wider society and the economy really as we work through the crisis. And obviously none of us know or can predict what is going to happen next. But I think our real concern has been the quite frightening level of need that organisations are seeing, and some of the data coming back it is showing. A number of organisations have been supported to deliver immediate need, so making sure that children are kind of safe, fed, warm through the crisis. And there's a number of hardship funds or support funds that a number of organisations have set up to support. And what's coming back from that is that while those are supporting individual families immediately, and that's of course extremely important, that the level of demand is outstripping the support that is available. So I know that Action for Children, your support fund, has been exhausted. One Parent Families Scotland launched 2,000 grants for heating support on Friday that have already all been given out. Aberlour has been reporting a 1,400% increase in their crisis fund since the start of the crisis. We've got a lot of kind of evidence around just increasing numbers of families not being able to pay for food, having difficulty paying utility bills and meeting the essential requirements for families. So we've been pulling that kind of evidence together collectively to demonstrate the level of need. And I think while we welcome support that Scottish Government has put in place and done so very quickly to meet those immediate needs, both in terms of increasing the social welfare fund and support that's been made available to individual organisations, we are concerned about whether that's enough to meet demand at the moment, and what more needs to be put in place. So I think everyone will be aware that Scottish Government is committed to introducing the Scottish Child Payment as quickly as possible, and that we are all very supportive of that measure, but understand that the logistics of that mean that that's not going to be in place for some time to come. And so what we've been discussing with Scottish Government is asking whether they could consider an emergency package of financial support at a national level that would supplement the work that's already happening and also provide a more predictable and national response to families across the country. And essentially, we have been looking at whether there's existing mechanisms that the government could use to increase family incomes immediately to the equivalent of, or at least to the value of the child poverty payment. And so kind of meeting that kind of immediate need. So, as I say, we understand the challenges of setting up the Scottish Child Payment, but there are a number of existing mechanisms that we can use to provide financial support to families, and it could be a combination of looking at the Scottish Welfare Fund and how that could be used to provide crisis grants to families, Best Start grants, potentially topping up child benefits, school clothing grants. There's a number of mechanisms we could look at in order to introduce a payment more immediately. I think, the key thing is ensuring that families have enough money now to meet the immediate needs of their families. And we are increasingly concerned about the collective impact that this is having across the country. So the main kind of discussion with Scottish Government has been around us asking them to consider whether that would be something that we could look at, an additional payment. And I guess that would be the priority in terms of increasing family incomes, because we know we think that would be the best way to support families. But alongside that, there's also steps that could be taken to support families in meeting immediate needs or essential costs, essentially, and thinking about some of those essential costs and how those have changed during the crisis as part of the lockdown down and what it means for schools being closed. So I know a number of you will be aware that there's been or may have signed up to support letters around free school meals, and the government has asked local authorities to provide cash payments, or to consider cash payments, which I don't think is happening in every local authority. In some local authorities are providing vouchers or food packages, and also looking at data and device access, which I think at the last forum meeting we had a discussion about as one of the kind of key themes. And there's a lot of work that Scottish Government are doing around supporting digital access, but particularly thinking about the youngest children who are living in poverty and their families, and making sure that they have access to be able to further learning and development, but also in terms of being able to keep in touch with friends and families, and actually from a poverty perspective, for some families to be able to access online forms to access benefits. So I guess there's a number of steps we've also been discussing around meeting those immediate needs, but the priority for us has been around what more we could do to support families living in poverty to increase their incomes, given the scale of what we're seeing on the ground. We have got a short note that sets out some of the evidence that we have collectively, and also the policy calls that we can share. As I say, we've had some discussions with colleagues in Scottish Government around this, and we are looking to provide an update to Scottish Government this week, just with a bit more information on the latest data we have in terms of the level of need. So that's the kind of work that's been ongoing around child poverty by a number of organisations, as I say, forum members and members of the wider End Child Poverty Coalition. I think there'll be an opportunity later to maybe discuss the role of the forum on child poverty, but that's probably the key things for me to update at this stage, if anybody's got any questions or reflections.
I mean, obviously, fantastic work by Save the Children and others to really try and corral this sort of pretty overwhelming picture of need of families. Thank you so much for that.
So I was just to kind of echo some of the comments in the context. So Bernardo's and ourselves put forward a bid to the Wellbeing Fund, and our bid was something like 166k to over a 6 weeks period to get to the most vulnerable children and families. Bernardo's was similar. So between the two of us, we had a national spread. There was only 2 local authorities we weren't in, but we managed to cover them. For us, that went out the door in 2 weeks. So within 2 weeks, that 6 week fund was totally committed, and we had a backlog of 80-odd thousand, which we've covered from our own emergency appeal. But we've got a backlog again. The need out there is huge, particularly with vulnerable families and communities. And I think the Wellbeing Fund's been excellent, because whatever other measures are put in place, whether through welfare arrangements, having that immediate emergency support is critical. Keeping families afloat, keeping young people afloat, keeping some communities afloat, reducing the temperature around was also crucial in terms of allowing us to get eyes on the young people. So mobilising our staff teams, getting into houses, seeing where the kids were at, seeing what the issues were, and all that was really important. But as the pandemic goes on, as the lockdown goes on, the issues will get worse. So that income supplement will be crucial going forward. I mean, we're seeing huge issues out there still. So just a bit of context, really.
One of the challenges we're facing, we're burning cash, and we're burning cash short term, and we can go from one crisis to the next. And I think part of the discussion needs to open up that says this is with us for the next 2 years. So we need to get past 3 months at a time, because we are just, I mean, we had a 24/7 helpline anyway, but we're funding that through our own reserves now. We run into challenges around rate, and I think probably Bernardo's do this. We run into challenges in raising funding, because then we reflect back to our balance sheet that says, why don't you pay that yourselves? And I get that too, but that will then put us all in a place 6 months' time when we're not here. So I think some way we need to get to, how do we talk about funding properly? Because one element is how we deal with poverty, but the other element for me is how we keep those services that are there to support it going more than 3 months at a time.
I'd really like to make sure as well that we do have some time, perhaps at the end, because clearly what we're seeing is an incredible effort by organisations and Scottish Government to, as one of you said, throw money at this because that's the necessary response. But this isn't sustainable, and clearly there are going to be worries in relation to, are we making sure that everybody who needs this is getting that, because we're in such a, so busy. It feels very uncomfortable, I think, being so dependent on who some organisations will know and people telling us and organisations that they are in need. So inevitably there will be a fair amount of unmet need, and also I think there are some questions for us as organisations, the extent to which would we be. How do we keep a grip on the range of responses that we're being asked to make and letters that we're writing in? I just worry that we're potentially losing a bit more of a, if you like, a strategic grip on this, while recognising the need for very quick responses. I'd definitely be with you in relation to next steps for us as a forum. But I'm wondering what it's looking like from the government's perspective.
Obviously there's. As you've touched on, there's a considerable amount of work underway. So Ms Campbell announced the £350 million package of community support last month. So obviously our immediate focus has been on mobilising those funds, ensuring that they're getting out to the people in need. The funding streams like the Wellbeing Fund, the Support and Communities Fund is accessible, and it's delivering support to those organisations that are delivering frontline services. So obviously the Wellbeing Fund the applications are due to be made by close today. So funds will start to be divested from that. Our Support and Communities Fund that's going out through community anchor organisations, the likes of housing associations, support community efforts. And again, money is now starting to go out through that fund. So yeah, certainly there will need to be a kind of, I think about how we take this approach long term. And I know obviously the First Minister published that kind of first look at how we started to make the decisions about moving out of lockdown and start to then think about recovery and our kind of longer term position. So yeah, there is a lot of work to be done thinking about the next steps. I think we're in quite a good space in terms of the range of support that we've mobilised incredibly quickly to ensure that those people that are now in quite difficult circumstances are supported. But yeah, I think we do need to continue working together to ensure that the next stage, it continues and it's obviously sustainable, as you've said. Beyond
the immediate getting money to families, the wider impact potentially on families, for example, of out of school care, early learning childcare, not being in place, the wider systems that are impacting on our children and families. Again, recognising we're in an emergency situation, but as we emerge from this, there are a range of other approaches we need to make sure are still in place, very much around, as No Child Left Behind stated. But comments on that?
We've probably got a fair bit we want to say about that. It'll move us on a bit. Are you wanting to do that now?
I think then, could I just ask, people obviously feel quite concerned about the other strand that we maybe just need to hear very briefly from, if that's okay, is around the digital access. Would that be all right? And then perhaps you could pull together responses. That a few points here around your digital exclusion point, and then we'll ask Scottish Government to pull together what they've heard.
Probably the biggest concern for me, I read the Youth Parliament's survey of digital inclusion. And one of the stats that came out was, I think it was something like 99% of young people felt that they could access system and benefits, etc. I would probably argue that 100% of the young people we work with can't do that for a variety of reasons, because they're the young people who are at most disadvantaged going through this. My concern is that we're working on an erroneous assumption that yes, because the bigger number might be able to access the ones that really need help, the ones that are really struggling do not have that access. And therefore, if we start making policy based around that group of people, we've completely excluded the ones that are really, really suffering. And I'm really concerned about that.
Very, very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, very pleased to pick up a number of the points that have been made, because they're very similar conversations to other conversations that are happening all over the sector just now, I think, although I think the contribution of the third sector in particular has been extremely helpful in illuminating where we need to go over the next few weeks, the next few months, and probably the next few years as well. I hope people will know that we published a report just over a couple of weeks ago perhaps, on the impact of COVID-19 on children and families in the first 2 or 3 weeks of lockdown, and a lot of colleagues from the third sector contributed very significantly to that report, so thank you for doing that. That set the scene, I think. It told a number of stories. It made clear that the initial weeks had been quite a confusing time, but also that services on the ground had been transformed, particularly I think third sector services that had been very fleet of foot and moved to a different delivery model, still seeing some children, some families face to face, but supporting lots of other families through other means and critically through online means. And it appeared quite quickly that we'd developed 3 different models of response. One model at one tier, which was about those children and families who are at greatest risk, and about health visitors and social workers and others continuing to prioritise those and having face-to-face contact with those. A second group of children who we already knew had vulnerabilities, who we were developing a much broader response to, that initially was meant to include attendance at the education hubs. It was clear, however, very early on that wasn't happening. The stay-at-home message was very important for families, and also most practitioners took the view that it was better to get support to children where they lived, rather than asking them to travel to alternative education. So the numbers attending those hubs has increased after the Easter break. It's now over double what it was before the Easter break, around 1,100, 1,200. But that's still a small percentage of children with multi-agency plans. So we've had to look right across the sector at how we respond to that whole range of children. And thirdly, a whole number of new children and families who've never needed help before, now needing to access support. And they're doing that in a whole range of ways. And I think we're still trying to work out and make sense of all the different ways that they're getting that support. But clearly, third sector organisations are a big component of that. So that report set the scene. On top of that, really what we've been trying to do is firstly have conversations to understand the impact of COVID-19 for children and families, and then have conversations about what we should be doing about that. In relation to that, the initial report was somewhat anecdotal. We have now established a data set with local partnerships about some key issues, about what's happening with regard to child protection, looked after children, and how children in the system are currently being supported, including our care leavers. We had the first data set return last week. 29 out of 32 authorities responded very quickly. We have the second collection of that data today, where I hope it will be a complete return, and we're also going to look at comparator information. So, for example, how many child protection interagency referral discussions did we have this time last year, and how many are we having today? The clear picture that's developing from all of that activity, and it's been reflected already this morning, and it's the same picture that we see across the rest of the UK. We've had a lot of contact with the other 3 nations in the UK, is that there's significant pressure on the families just now. The loss of income has had, as has already been said, an enormous impact, but also family relationships and mental health are very significant issues. That's showing in contacts for support, in contacts on websites, in calls on helplines. I think someone already said the parent line calls have gone up very dramatically. However, in terms of what you might call new business, in terms of formal referrals to services, be they domestic abuse services, child protection services, or just general social work support, it's all down. So child protection referrals are down, not down quite as much as they were at the start of the lockdown. Domestic abuse referrals are down, and we're seeing that picture across the country. All of that conversation has led to a consensus that we have talked to the third sector about, but we do now need to engage with the third sector about, of pooling our endeavours around real collective leadership to deliver getting it right for every child. In Scotland, we've made great strides on getting it right for every child, and I think we had very good collaborative leadership. But the crisis really calls on us to work very differently and very collectively to pool our efforts in terms of how we might move forward. And we are working with Solace and with COSLA to pull together a leadership group to try and take us forward to address the sort of key issues that we've been speaking about so far this morning, and very much the third sector needs to be part of that. We also need to look at how we work in government. Over the last couple of weeks, we've had a number of conversations about how we follow the service transformation that many of your organisations have already been through to pool our efforts in terms of supporting this major activity. Most of activity is around addressing the sort of issues that have been spoken about this morning. And I'll just pick out 4 or 5 of those. Firstly, we need to sustain critical services in the here and now, and we need to ensure that children in the here and now are getting support. And in terms of critical services, I'm particularly thinking about care placements. It's been very challenging for residential care. Those of you who run residential care will know that. In foster care, in supporting kinship care. I think those services have responded magnificently. There were concerns in the early days of the lockdown that some of those might be very troubled, but they have been resilient and they have seen through the first 5-6 weeks of lockdown, but we do need to sustain them into the future. There is the digital exclusion issue, and we do need to be very clear that a lot of activity is now going through online means, and some of our most excluded children and families don't have access to that. No One Left Behind has been an excellent initiative. Abelour and Children First have been very helpful as part of that, looking at getting kit out very quickly to families that they're working with. Authorities up and down the country have been part of that. I know that Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire were putting out hundreds of new kit just the other day. But as people have said, we really do need to, I'll use a phrase we hear a lot just now, ramp up that activity, and it needs to be much more strategic. In government, we're certainly looking at that, and we do recognise that if we do that, that will have funding demands. But also we do need to look at get practical support to families, the sort of things we've heard this morning. And there are probably some groups where our intelligence about how COVID-19 is impacting is less good, or we're not really hearing the voice. 3 groups that I would particularly mention is Black and ethnic minority families, families with children affected by disability, and although we've all identified the issue, families where there is increased domestic abuse, because hearing the voice from that families is even more difficult just now during COVID-19. So we perhaps need to think a bit more about that. But critically, if we recognise that there's a pressure cooker situation for children and families just now, and that the steam is not getting out, that steam will burst out at some time very soon, probably as soon as the lockdown starts to be relaxed. And we have to anticipate the surge that will create. And we have to be ready for that. We could have 2 sorts of responses to that. We could respond in the normal way that too often we do when we're challenged, which is to work in silos, to look at formal interventions, to look at receiving children into care, to look at children joining waiting lists for paediatrics and waiting lists for CAMS. I don't think any of us think that'll be the way we should go. What's happened over the last 6 weeks, and we heard it already this morning, is that people have got alongside families, that services have worked in new ways, transformed how they do things, stripped out some of the bureaucracy, and just got in there. And we really have to look at an army of holistic family support to go alongside families and empower them to be resilient. So that's really the thinking that we've got in government just now, how we can respond in a much more family supportive way, but trying to get alongside families as we move into the recovery phase to support them to be resilient into the future. That's a quick overview. Other colleagues might want to come in, but I'm sure there's lots there that you want to talk about.
Thank you very much for that really helpful overview, and clearly your thinking and your government colleagues' thinking is absolutely in line with where forum representatives and beyond are at as well. I'm picking up on a couple of questions here. I think it would be a couple of people are saying that it's, or I think what I'm picking up is that it's really great to hear that a leadership group's being established, and it's great to hear that there's work within Scottish Government. It's perhaps not feeling quite as aligned as we'd hope, and at this stage, recognising it's very difficult. And I suppose it's a leadership group, I think, or something similar was mentioned at our meeting 3 or 4 weeks ago. And I suppose, and third sector involvement and opportunities to engage in that group was mentioned. And I suppose if we could kick off questions and discussion, but with the question, when will we hear more specifics, and when can the forum essentially begin to align some of its work in terms of feeding into that group and as equal partners?
We have to work. It's quite challenging. It's also exciting in that we have to work through the existing structures to develop something new. And that does mean people taking bold steps. And we are talking about the fundamentals of how we run local government and central government in Scotland, and trying to do that very differently. And I think it's quite a small point, and a data set is not in itself going to revolutionise anything. But the fact that in Scotland we now do have a data set being collected in all 32 partnerships, I hope today, which has not yet been achieved in England, Wales or Northern Ireland, although they've been working at that for some time, I think is indicative of the willing that there is there. But we do have to engage with that. And as you say, in particular, we have to engage with the third sector about that, because we have the same issue across the third sector, don't we? We talk about third sector being diverse. We talk about the range of interests, and we also have to protect each of the stakeholder interests within the third sector. But we also recognise we need to come together around the crisis in a very different way. So we both need the third sector to feed into that partnership, but we also need the third sector to work as a partnership that can feed into that process. So there's two sorts of discussions we need to go on there. I think and hope it will happen imminently, but there's no single party in this can make the decisions. It is about everyone coming together around collective leadership.
Yeah, I think we'll all recognise that challenge and accept that's important at the moment. Thank you very much. Say anything about the Ethnic Minority Resilience Network?
I've got some bullet points from that actually that I can feed in about the discussions that they've been having around how the crisis is affecting particularly ethnic minority communities, and a lot of it is the same around that we've talked about already: access to food and finance, mental health as well. But that some of the other issues that have come up, which is worth making sure that are recorded and recognised, are the increased chance of prejudice directed to Far East Asian communities in particular, and also directed towards perceptions of particular communities as not adhering to social distancing, and Roma communities has been highlighted here. And then another issue that they've highlighted is really troubling and concerning is about individuals classified as undocumented migrants and the severe risk that they have of destitution and virus exposure. So there's some really significant concerns that they have. There's quite a big range of issues that they've identified.
Can I just add, any intelligence people have got, can they please just direct it into us? Just send it directly to me, and we'll continue to aggregate that and make sure that ministers see that.
Thank you. I was wondering about the data set and how so that's being collected by local authorities, and so local resilience partnerships and others feed into that data set. So, or is the information that the organisations, most of the organisations around the table here feed in, is that going to need to be another source of information? Or essentially, how can we round the picture up? But what is the third sector engagement in the local data sets at the moment?
So that data set is coming from two sources. It's coming from local chief officer groups. And in many of those, but not in all of those, unfortunately, the third sector will be involved. And it's also coming from Police Scotland in terms of some of the key child protection statistics. And we're also collecting statistics from Police Scotland on the number of children reported missing, both from family homes and from care. The hope is that what we'll get into is a cycle whereby we'll get the core statistics, we'll then make those available to colleagues in terms of that. But we then have a dialogue about what those statistics mean, and that dialogue then comes back and completes a cycle. So I would hope that we could publish a further commentary on what's happening and how services are responding. But that does really need to be informed by the data, and it's still somewhat anecdotal, as we've discussed this morning, in terms of our understanding.
Can I come in, mate, just to make a point about the data, but about the analysis, because you're right about families and communities being powder kegs, and things will kick off in different places. There's no doubt about it, and everything will change at the end of this. So it's how do we get that analysis to you? How do we get that kind of joined up thinking? So there's going to be lots of big issues for kids, even kids who are currently being in third year, going into fourth year, probably no incentive to go to school. What's going to happen to them? Youth crime's going to go up. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Youth unemployment's going to go up. Going to be lots of issues. How do we get that analysis and that discussion with government so that we're jointly clear about really what the issues are and getting that cold face understanding of what's happening?
Well, that's exactly what we're trying to do now. So hopefully that first report did that at the time, but that was a very confusing time. So we need that understanding now to inform how we move forward and inform significant strategic decisions. I hope it will inform an early strategic decision about digital inclusion, because that's certainly come to the fore. I think it's already informed that we need to look at how we support families in a very different way to how we've supported families before. But you're right, we also need to look at particular groups. There is planning happening around recovery just now, in particular in terms of learning. All I can say is about us having these conversations. We're happy that government, through the means we've talked about, is the base through which we all connect just now. And we are hoping that the leadership group, if and when we get that established, and hopefully that will be soon, does bring senior leaders together right across the sector to make some of those big decisions that you're talking about.
What I think I'm hearing, knowing you as well and your commitment, is that there's significant progress with the data set, and that clearly represents a really impressive milestone and source of information around the most critical needs of children. So that's great. And I think the leadership group is pulling together, will work on that together with perhaps over the longer term, and when I say longer term, I mean beyond this immediate crisis. But what I'm wondering is, how is the rich body of evidence, so learning disability in particular, we've got play, we've got the family work, how we can use this critical evidence to inform both the urgent work that you're talking about, but also that trying to take the heat off that pressure cooker that you're talking about that's across the piece in so many children and families. And I suppose it feels there's an awful lot that we could do and begin to do now. And it feels a little bit that there's an awful lot of goodwill here and a lot of, there's a resource here to draw on. Do we need to wait for permission really? What's the problem with getting going now a bit more to think through how we could genuinely really begin to make some progress, or at least gather information more strategically than is possibly been the case now?
I mean, I think there's two things we're talking about here, aren't we? One is a strategic response that's informed by good intelligence and that helps make sure we make the right decisions. And those are right decisions to help with the emergency, but also they're the right decisions to ensure that we minimise the impact on the outcomes of children and families throughout the rest of their lives. So we need that strategic response, and that has to be very carefully compiled. Also, what's wonderful just now is 1,000 flowers really are blooming. People have just got out there and done things, and people haven't waited to ask for permission for that. We both have to collectively, strategically try and get our house in order, but exactly at the same time, I think you're absolutely right. People haven't waited for permission. They've just gone out there and done the right thing, and that's entirely appropriate.
I think the other thing to say is, as I said, we're kind of compiling the things that people are sending in to us, but a big part of that is us trying to look across the piece of those things that are coming in and drawing out the key strategic issues and really try to not just look at them, but actually respond to them. And, we've done that in some of the issues that have been raised with us already, in terms of some clarity around furloughing, in terms of the issues around the FAC fund, for example. And those kind of things where there are some kind of quick fixes or things that we can do to enable some of the work that everybody is doing in support of families, then we want to do that. We want to be as responsive and agile with those things as possible. But we need that intelligence to come to us to be able to kind of sift through that and to begin that dialogue. So I would just encourage everybody to continue to kind of raise with us the things that they see are the key things where they need some support or help, that they can't just fix themselves, I suppose. And we will do our best, and we will be very focused on what we can do to respond to that.
Could I just maybe reflect back on that earlier comment? You're right, a lot of us have gone out and done things that we've done because we believe they're the right things. And now we've been asked to justify why we did what we did, and asked to justify why we spent the money that we did. And it takes me back into that discussion I don't think we're yet having, where we feel an absolute part of the decision-making process because our partners in this decision-making process are now making us justify things. I think unless we get to a place where we are a true partnership, then I think it's going to be a really hard next 12, 24 months. And I just don't feel we're yet changing that model of engagement between the third sector, government, COSLA and private sector. And I think going back to a point that you made, a lot of us have just cut through bureaucracy. And it feels a bit to me that the bureaucracy hasn't gone away and it will come back and bite us. And I think we just need to maybe tackle it now.
No, I think it's really important that in addition to fantastic work of individual organisations, the work that you talked about in terms of looking across the piece and aligning in almost thematically is really critical, because there will be many organisations that are vulnerable to that sort of the sort of behaviours. Bigger ones, will be a bit more powerful and stuff. And so we don't want inadvertently to create a hierarchy, if you like, of those that are a little bit more immune from some of these pressures because they have greater access or whatever, and others who are doing the right thing, innovatively, incredibly responsive, but because the particular area of work or their particular, means that they just don't, that they're maybe not as inoculated from some of the pressures as others are. So I think the plea of balancing that, valuing individual organisations, whoever they are, wherever they are, but also making sure that we work around the critical themes around our children and young people and their well-being will be really valuable as we move forward. In fact, I think it's imperative. I'm just really keen that CCPS you've done a power of work in terms of gathering particular issues that are affecting that your members have identified. So just, I know you've fed those into government, but just very briefly, do you, or is it, are there additional things to say and add for the benefit of other forum members?
Yeah, no, firstly, this conversation is really rich. There was only 2 issues, I think, currently, and one was around the fact that a halt had been put on transfers of young people, and particularly about care leavers. And it was Bernardo's that brought this up, saying that some young care leavers, some were in B&Bs and were actually getting put out during the day, and that there was others which were in very difficult situations. So we were just looking for a bit more flexibility, and so we're looking for maybe some kind of, not announcement, but some kind of conversations around there being more flexibility, especially for care leavers. The other one is around the digital poverty, about what was happening to young people involved in the justice system, and the fact that some of them are about to be released. However, they don't have mobiles, etc., so they haven't had contact, and that's increased anxiety because they don't have contact with family and also with those that can support them outside, social work, etc. So these have been 2 big issues. The one on testing, which was taken up with DFM, that we've not heard back on that, but that was just last week. So I know they were going off to look at that.
So testing is available to all social care staff, but there are challenges with it. If you have to drive out to Glasgow Airport or Aberdeen Airport to get that, and PPE should be out there, and there's plenty of PPE for social care in Scotland, but getting it to the right people at the right time is continuing to be a challenge. See, the 2 issues that you've raised, the digital one is very well known, and lots of organisations are just giving out phones. But could you do me? I don't know about the care leavers one. We are working on not guidance, but an agreed approach with the Chief Medical Officer to the issue of testing children who are moving between placements. And there have been some particular issues around that have made things difficult for children and for services. But could you do me a paragraph and an email on those 2 issues, and I'll make sure they get picked up?
Yeah, we've done that.
Okay.
Just as I discussed with you, I kind of pass them on to the relevant policy teams, and we'll just make sure that we can get a response on that as quickly as possible. But it just came in yesterday, so we're dealing with that as quickly as we can.
So I think that's a really good that's come up there in terms of some positives that actually folk have raised issues, and Scottish Government and others have gone away and made changes happen. So particularly PPE and testing, that's very, very encouraging. And also apologies to those of you who are not, who hadn't made applications to the Children Young People Fund and the Adult Learning, but it was, I'm very confident that as a result of this forum and no doubt other representations to Scottish Government officials and ministers listened to our plea for longer term funding to the end of the financial year, and we had that very shortly after the forum. So that was really fantastic, and many thanks to government officials for listening to us and representing our interests there.
So yes, I mean, I think, Carnegie obviously being one step removed, we've been thinking a lot about, what this means and what it's telling us. And the comment that I was making is that a lot of our networks and our partners are talking about how, and the phrase that comes up repeatedly is ripping up the rule book. And that's fantastic. We've talked a long time about the need for the public sector sometimes to get out of the way, the need for it to give permission to allow others to walk into that space. And that's very much what we're seeing. The difficulty for us and what we expect to happen at variable levels across Scotland and at variable times is a reassertion of that power. So, unless it is part of a new narrative, part of a really strong culture change, then we'll get a return to the norm, which I think for those of you who are working, flat out, trying to deliver, trying to make things happen, will both personally and organisationally be incredibly difficult. So I think, there's a real need to be just continually reinforcing that point, that, what's happening in the crisis should be the new normal. We should be carrying this learning through. And I think lots of people are saying that in lots of different ways, but the more we all say it collectively together, the stronger the point is.
And in terms of, I know it's very difficult to say because you're so busy around the response to COVID, but there are, I think it's been referred to earlier, and there are several advisory groups and think tanks setting up next steps following the crisis, and that's great. Obviously, as many ideas around it is really good, but if it doesn't get to the heart of the issue, and I think particularly for children and families, I suppose I worry about a lot of chat that's maybe unfocused. And again, I'd hope that perhaps this leadership group, if it's looking at children and families and deeper structural issues to achieve change, would be a really effective way, wouldn't it, of looking through the long term. Do you think, is that in your sights really? Is it a little bit more around the practical sort of short and medium term?
I'm not known for quoting John Swinney, but I've heard him say that we've been working towards getting it right for every child in Scotland. I don't think any of us think we're 100% embedded. And we've had to move what he calls the public service proposition in the last 6 weeks in a truly radical way. And he hopes that that's absolutely cemented into how we move forward. And I think we're all saying the same thing. But actually doing that when we've had 100 years of the norm is quite difficult. And, it challenges all of us. But we have to take some of the learning from how we've responded to the crisis into the future and do things in a different way. I think I hear everyone saying that.
Excellent. Okay, well, let's that almost sets, I think, the forum's sort of ambition, doesn't it, for and work program, I think, for how we really need to make sure that the commitment that the children's sector workforce is showing at the moment, we couldn't possibly let them down in terms of going back to the old status quo. So it'll be really exciting working with you all on how we take forward. And I think this is actually what the ambition of getting it right for every child is all about. So here's this, it would be really fantastic to make the sort of next phase of that implementation work, given how hard we've all worked over the last decade or so on this. I'd like to move to UNCRC, just a couple of very practical questions.
It was just a genuine question. We've got the Scottish Leaders Forum, and the Scottish Leaders Forum, I think, set up 4 subgroups. And I'm just wondering, is this leadership group, is that a different group? And have we backburnered the Scottish Leaders Forum?
No, the Scottish Leaders Forum's ongoing, and that's the context for collective leadership. But what the leadership group is about, one of the discussions is it about children's services or is it about children, adults and family services? That's one of the debates that's going on just now. But it is about focusing on the discussion we're having today, not the broader public sector context of the Leaders Forum, which I'm sure will continue.
Okay.
Just really with the perinatal infant mental health and also the independent care review, putting family support front and centre as early prevention and intervention stuff. It's really, this all feels like we're flowing into the independent care review. I'm just wondering where that sits now and what are the short-term plans for that, because it feels like March the 31st, and March was the longest month on the record, and it feels a long time ago.
Yeah, well, it's all the same thing, isn't it? And I mean, you'll know a lot of the discussions around the mental health task force and the programme board has been about early intervention and preventative action, not about referring children to specialist services. So it's very much the same. Clearly, the impact of COVID has impacted on the plans to move forward with that, and that's still being discussed, but it very much is as part of the recommendation from the Independent Care Review about supporting families. Sorry, I shouldn't say recommendation, the output from the Independent Care Review.
Yeah, I mean, not a huge amount more to add on the care review, apart from the fact that in the context of our family support work that we were doing pre-COVID, we were clearly linking very, very closely in with what the care review team in government was doing in terms of response to the review. And that continues to be the case. And the recommendations or the outputs in terms of early intervention and the importance of family support were upfront and throughout the report, and that will not be lost, and it's very much in the forefront of our mind, and as you mentioned, in the forefront of John Swinney's mind as well. On the mental health side of things, I've got a short update from the team. The key things are, there's a lot of work going on within the mental health policy team there. They've established a children, young people and families relationships work stream. They are doing a lot of stuff that they're putting up on the Parent Club website, as we know, in terms of children's mental well-being. And just recently, they've obviously launched through Inspiring Scotland, the new perinatal and early years mental health fund, which is £1 million a year. So there's lots of things that are going on. And the other thing, the Mind Your Time Mind Your Time resource, which has been launched as well. There's a power of work going on there that we are linking very closely with, and we're having weekly catch-ups with that team to make sure that we are connecting the different strands of all of this work and make sure that we're aligning this as a joined up package of activity.
Great, thanks very much.
In terms of Together's work, then obviously we're continuing to consult with our members and support Scottish Government as they progress their work in developing a bill on incorporation. At the same time, there are kind of bearing up in mind our purpose of making sure that children and young people's rights are upheld now. Members are raising a number of kind of rights concerns with us that we have collated into a great big document that I'm trying to edit because nobody's got the time to read the length of document that we have now. It's mapped against the 11 recommendations that have been made by the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child about how states should be responding to COVID. And so this covers everything from kind of health and social impacts through to the right to play, online learning, issues around accessibility to and access to the internet, child protection services. So we're finishing all of this today and we'll send it through to the strategic forum. Obviously it's a work in development, but what we're trying to do is support government to ensure that their response is compliant with the UNCRC and also continues to take into account the rights of the most vulnerable groups. Members have really highlighted the impact that this current situation is having on undocumented migrants, on unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, issues as well around children with disabilities, children whose parents have disabilities. So all of these issues are being raised and we will submit them to government so that hopefully we can link up our members with the relevant policy leads. One just further thing to add is that I've been asked to speak at an event next week, which is for the permanent missions at the UN about the Scottish Government's response to COVID and also what a child rights based approach to COVID would look like. So this is my opportunity to talk about the fact that our government has done the child rights impact assessment on the Scottish coronavirus bill, and also to reflect on some of the work that particularly has been going into supporting children living in families in poverty. So we're just really keen to carry on hearing from our membership. We are really keen to get our analysis out so that members can add to that and just make sure that we offer the support that maybe Scottish Government needs to ensure that the rights of the most vulnerable children are upheld at this time.
Really fantastic. Thank you so much. That's really good.
Yeah, just to say we're trying to kind of engage with folk and share that information, and we'll continue to do that. Also, just continuing on that point about, I picked up there was a lot of concern about participation of children and young people as well in kind of in informing what's going on around the COVID response. So obviously the work that's been done with yourselves, Children in Scotland, SYP, Children's Parliament, Young Scot, has been really, a really fantastic foundation for gathering information about the experiences of children and young people. But I totally recognise that there's a reliance on digital access in that context. So I'm kind of taking that as an area that we want to consider much more fully, particularly in relation to kind of the equalities impact of COVID as well. So if people are sharing information about particular groups, if you have my email address as well, please do copy it to me as well, because I'm kind of leading on the rights and equalities aspect specifically. So just to say, really aware of that and really aware of the digital access point more broadly. And then I suppose I just simply wanted to add, again, I'm sure you've heard this at the last meeting, but the kind of ministerial commitment to the bill to incorporate the UNCRC in this parliamentary session is still absolutely clear. We are not envisaging any change to the timescale for the bill as it stands. So we're looking to have that legislation passed ahead of the next Scottish parliamentary elections in kind of early summer, late spring next year. So that is absolutely, that is not going away. One of the things I'm quite conscious of, there hasn't really been any strong communications to that effect, other than kind of at official level. So we're just having a look to see when would it be appropriate for ministers to make this announcement. The reason, and I'm being very open about this, communications at the moment is a very crowded space, and we're having to prioritise what communications we're doing in relation to kind of COVID. So at the moment we just need to think about what would be appropriate in relation to communicating about the bill itself. So hopefully that helps, and hopefully we will have more external communication soon to back that up.
I think it's deeply impressive that there's no let up in the commitment to taking through the legislation at this incredibly busy time, and making sure that there's time in Parliament to enable that legislation to get through. So that's sincere thanks. They're doing the right thing, in difficult circumstances. So thank you very much. And I'm just really keen. Both of you highlighted some obviously concerns around children with additional needs. We've touched on some of them. Wondering if is there anything in particular?
Yeah, there's a number of things that we would be able to put forward, and I'd be able to do that kind of briefly after this meeting, in terms of also drawing on our submissions to the Equality and Human Rights Committee on around a number of the issues that are particularly impacting people with learning disabilities. But with regard, just very briefly, there's some specific issues around how children and young people with additional support needs are accessing education and support to education during this time. That links again to kind of broader points around digital inclusion, and how we would ensure that that was addressed, and that those children and young people, particularly those living in poverty, have access to those kinds of resources to support them with their learning during this time. Also, one of the issues that I've had fed into me, and some examples on this, is particularly where parents have disabilities and maybe have learning disabilities whose children have previously been in care, or who are kind of on the edges of care, and around where when the initial kind of emergency situation started, and they had home kind of family-based support coming in every kind of couple of days, that support was then removed, which resulted in the children being placed in foster care for the kind of duration of the emergency situation, because that obviously that family support had to be removed in terms of kind of protection around COVID and social distancing. But really just to highlight that as something that has been fed into us, and about really how we look at planning to ensure that family support, when appropriate, and when no additional health risks are in place, is put back in place as quickly as possible, so that these children can be returned to their homes.
That's great. If that's okay to round off the UNCRC discussion, obviously critical issues read across there around play across the sector, very young children throughout, including inclusion needs. Is there anything else to add? And I know you've already put up that there'll be some more information flowing through to government and others.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've done a number of things. We've got some short videos out with subtitles to try and make them inclusive on social media. I think the anxiety across the 4 nations about children's play is this lack of emphasis on guidance for getting children outdoors every day. I know they can't play in the usual way, but I think we feel we would have preferred to have had, and certainly as if lockdown restrictions are going to ease, that we would have some commitment to children playing in the public realm and the streets and green spaces becomes a priority, because particularly for those without gardens, and I think there's 29% of families in Scotland live in flats, so that's a huge amount of children that don't have access to outdoor play on a daily basis. And I think the impact on their mental health and well-being is massive. Everybody said it already, I don't need to repeat it. So I think it'd be really good to hear the government come out and actually commit to this being a priority. And I know a lot of the street spaces are being converted with pop-up furniture in some places for cycling and things like that. But I think we need to give some thought about how we can promote play under current restrictions.
It's another one of these issues. You can't divide them up, but clearly around children's rights, they're around play, but obviously also around children's access.
Yeah, I was just going to say play falls within the family unit remit as well, and I know I'm happy to kind of pick that up in a bit more detail with you and scope that out a little bit more.
And just, I think we've covered everything that we wanted to cover that we'd planned for in advance, but maybe a couple of words from you. I know that you're Wellington, but I think it'd be helpful to, just for completeness, really think about this sort of obviously with the deferral around early learning childcare and family issues, and just your insights on that and anything that you want the forum to be mindful of.
I've just been listening with interest and really echo all of the comments, like that we are finding a lot of those issues as well. And there's a real concern moving forward, and it was heartening to see Dr. Jason Leach putting out the video around the sort of element of young children not quite understanding all of what's happening to them at the moment. So it was good that he issued that video to talk about how it's so difficult for young children to understand what's going on, and the impact of children that are in the critical care hubs at the moment. There's a real sense of anxiety from our members and early learning childcare staff as to how they really support children and families at this time as well. So really just we're working closely with our colleagues in Scottish Government as well to look at the phasing of all of this.
Thank you for listening to the Children in Scotland podcast. To find out more about any of our work or about joining us in membership, head to our website at www.childreninscotland.org.uk.